Welcome to this explainer. It's funny, if you really stop and think about it, why does the history we learn in school often look completely different from the reality actually lived by everyday people? Today, we are tracing the ideological evolution of the socialist challenge. We're going to dive right into Chapter 13 of historian Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States, to look at early American labor movements. And then, we'll explore how these exact same critiques of capitalism and power rippled out globally and evolved over time. Now, to be clear, we aren't here to take sides today. We're just here to understand exactly what these authors are arguing and see how their ideas interlock. Here is how we're breaking this down today. First, history from the bottom up. Second, the early socialist challenge. Third, race, class, and oppression. Fourth, the global exploitation web. And finally, number 5, avoiding the class question. All right, let's kick things off with part 1, history from the bottom up. Think back to the history textbooks you read in middle school. Usually, they're what we call orthodox histories. They center heavily on statesmen, basically teaching us that in times of crisis, we have to look up to elite leaders and presidents to swoop in and save the day. But Zinn, he completely flips this script. He proposes a bottom-up approach. He argues that whenever history is presented as this unified, happy family narrative, it's actually concealing some incredibly fierce conflicts of interest. So his lens actively emphasizes the struggles between the dominators and the dominated, focusing squarely on the conquered, the workers, and marginalized resistance movements. And that brings us to the core premise of Zinn's book. He basically says, look, as thinking people, it is our job to not simply accept the memory of states as our own. He really wants to jolt us into a greater consciousness of class conflict and racial injustice by viewing American history from the standpoint of the dispossessed, rather than from the conquerors. Moving right along to Section 2, the early socialist challenge. So picture the economic crisis of 1893. It was brutal. And to capture that grim reality, Zinn highlights these intensely vivid, honestly kind of horrifying metaphors used by era organizers. They felt the capitalist class, quote, like a devilfish, had grasped them with its tentacles. That gives you a real sense of just how suffocating corporate monopolies felt to the everyday worker. They literally felt like they were being dragged down into fathomless depths of degradation, strictly for someone else's profit. As you can imagine, this anger escalated incredibly fast. In the 1890s, the U.S. saw about 1,000 strikes a year. But by 1904, that number quadrupled to 4,000. And right around then, in 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. Actually, fun fact here, Sinclair intended his book to expose the brutal wage-slave conditions of meatpacking workers, but the public ended up way more outraged about the tainted meat itself. Still, the underlying idea that people might cooperatively use the Earth's resources rather than being exploited for profit was gaining some serious momentum. Now here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just some big city factory worker phenomenon. Drawing on historian James Green, Zinn shows us this incredibly unexpected diverse coalition. You had indebted homesteaders right alongside migratory tenant farmers, coal miners, lumberjacks, and even preachers and school teachers out on the sun-baked prairies. It was this massive, totally unlikely alliance of rural and working-class Americans, all united in seeking cooperative ownership. Which leads us directly into part 3, race, class, and oppression. Building on those early 1900s labor critiques, later activists started deeply connecting the dots between class and racial oppression. In her autobiography, Angela Davis recounts her realization that mere legal changes just weren't enough. For her, the exploitation of class and the subjugation of race were completely structurally intertwined. She argued that to effectively fight racism, you had to literally destroy its material economic foundations. You had to weed it out of the economy through a socialist framework. We see a really similar synthesis in the work of George L. Jackson, who applied Marxist theory directly to the American penal system and the Black experience. Amazingly, he actually wrote his book, Blood in My Eye, from inside maximum security confinement. He essentially turned his pen into a weapon of liberation, explicitly connecting the historical economic struggles to his very present reality behind bars. Jackson made this incredibly potent argument that the Black revolutionary is, in his words, twice doomed. He viewed the system as an advancing fascist corporativist state where individuals weren't just exploited for their labor, they were simultaneously being held down by deeply ingrained institutionalized racism. It was a uniquely vicious dual layer of oppression. True liberation, he concluded, required a total reversal of ownership. Next up, Section 4, the global exploitation web. Have you ever wondered how a region can be absolutely packed with natural resources, yet its people remain incredibly poor? Well, in Open Veins of Latin America, Eduardo Galeano argues that this isn't an accident. He deliberately juxtaposes immense natural wealth, things like gold, silver, and sugar, with systemic poverty. He claims the region's impoverishment is the direct consequence of those resources being extracted for foreign corporate profit. In other words, the wealth of the land literally causes the poverty of the people. So these authors take the socialist critique and expand it into this massive global ripple effect, whether it's Che Guevara analyzing the agrarian roots of the Cuban Revolution, or Galeano noting how foreign capital inevitably ends up dominating domestic affairs. The core argument is identical. Anti-imperialism is framed as a necessary reaction to an international web of resource and labor extraction, a web designed to keep the dispossessed exactly where they are. And finally, that brings us to Section 5. Avoiding the class question. All right, so Michael Parenti points out something fascinating in his book, Black Shirts and Reds. He argues that class has essentially become a forbidden C word. He says it is actively avoided and suppressed in mainstream public discourse, specifically to hide the realities of free market rapacity. Basically, if we don't talk about class, we just don't have to face the undeniable links between wealth and power. To back this up, Parenti points to the integration of former communist countries into the global capitalist system. He argues that these free market reforms didn't just bring open trade, they led to the expropriation of land, the dismantling of social programs, and a severely downgraded workforce. His text claims that this capitalist restoration essentially just concentrated wealth at the very top while triggering dramatic spikes in poverty and crime for the working masses. So, from the early U.S. labor struggles documented in Howard Zinn's Chapter 13, all the way to global anti-imperialist movements, the authors we've looked at today position class as a central driving force of history. We want to leave you with this provocative thought. If understanding our history and our societal structures absolutely requires an understanding of class, who truly benefits when the vocabulary of the dispossessed is erased from the conversation?